I think it's vitally important for the residents of that area.
Thank you, Deputy. Thank you. Moving on to the Social Democrats, Deputy Holly Cairns.
Thank you, Lasca Corla. I'd like to thank the Rural Independent Group for bringing forward this motion. I don't agree with all aspects of the motion, but I welcome that it's highlighting the issue of flooding impacting families, communities and businesses across Ireland. Last weekend we had the first of the winter storms, Aidan, but West Cork has been hit by wave after wave of flood events. Bantry in particular has been flooded multiple times, but so many other areas have been affected as well, areas like Skibbereen, Demanway and Rosscarbery. The list goes on, and this happened over the summer months, so families and business in these areas are deeply concerned about risks of more floods as the winter storm season starts. As the motion states, flooding has far-reaching, devastating impacts across a range of factors, from the economic ones to the emotional toll. Flooding is desperate at the best of times, not to mention in the midst of one of the hardest years for communities and small businesses. It's imperative that they're supported and that immediate action is taken to address the underlying issues. The government needs to develop a two-pronged strategy that addresses the underlying issues and the immediate needs. Policies that cause climate change, building on floodplains, poor maintenance of infrastructure, poor management of agricultural land and lack of forestry all contribute to the increase in flooding. We need to address causes as well as building defences. Our planning, land use and agricultural policies need to reflect this reality. We need to start looking at issues more comprehensively. We need to adopt a watershed approach to river flooding, which takes an integrated view of the whole river system. Flood management projects need to be rolled out alongside afforestation, habitat restoration, water quality improvements and better planning. In coastal areas, wetlands and beaches need to be preserved and protected over the summer. I was moving back and forth between local authorities, the EPA, the National Parks and Wildlife Services, trying to ensure the law was being enforced for beaches like Longstrand and the Gary Lucas Marsh. We need a commitment for action in these areas. We need to strategically prioritise and use natural flood management measures. For people who claim to value the land, we do not value nature-based landscape solutions. Forestry, bog restoration, planting hedgerows and sustainable urban drainage are essential and established cost-effective solutions. When larger projects are necessary, they need to happen in a timely manner and in consultation with local communities. Too often decisions are made for communities, leading to unnecessary delays and objections, whereas a more participatory approach would help address local concerns on the outset. Our flood management planning needs to adhere to the Århus Convention and EU directives on public participation to enable individuals, groups and small businesses to be involved in the decision-making process. Local people have a deep understanding of the problems and potential solutions in the areas. If the OPW took a more inclusive and proactive approach in involving the public on many of these issues, planning delays and reviews and objections would be avoided in the first place. As this motion states, government needs to accelerate its planned flood defence projects. Currently, Bantry, which floods regularly, will not have the new culverts to prevent fluvial flooding until at least 2020 or 2023, and the flood relief scheme for tidal flooding isn't expected to be finished until 2027, and those schemes are underway. According to information provided to me by the Minister for Public Expenditure and Reform, the proposed schemes for Castletownbere, Inishannon and Schull aren't even at the design planning stage yet and are scheduled to be done by 2027. So this is incredibly worrying for those communities. In the meantime, the government needs to put in temporary infrastructure and targeted support. If the Square in Bantry is going to keep flooding for the next 7 years, then the County Council should be funded to provide floodgates, at the very least for premises and other small businesses and other small-scale but necessary interventions. As the motion states, the current approach to flood insurance is not fit for purpose, and the Minister for Finance needs to work with the industry to come up with a solution for this. While the emergency humanitarian scheme is so welcome, it also needs to be reviewed in response to a PQ to the Taoiseach. He informed me that 27 businesses from County Cork applied for the scheme recently relating to flooding events in August, and of that, 17 have been successful, which is great, but 4 unsuccessful and 6 are pending, so we need that system to be accessible to everyone who needs it. On those numbers of the completed applications, almost 1/5 are being rejected, and I know from a case in Bantry it had to do with a technical requirement they were unaware of. These places are going to flood again and again, and we should have systems that work for everybody and not against some. Every business affected should get support, so the process needs to reflect that reality on the ground. The motion also references the predicted increase in flooding events, both in terms of frequency and scale in coming years. This increase, needless to say, is due to climate change. Any action to address flooding must also include clearly defined, enforceable and just climate action. Ireland has repeatedly failed to meet its moral and legal obligations to reduce emissions. By this year, we were supposed to have achieved a 20% reduction in emissions on 2005 levels. However, the government's annual transition statement projects it will be in the range of 5 to 6%. The current focus on efficiencies, overachievements and placing responsibility on individuals rather than big industries has failed. If we're serious about addressing floods and keeping people on the land, we need climate action. People in rural areas, farmers and fishing communities understand this situation. They know that change is inevitable and they have always responded to these challenges. But a just transition needs to be at the centre of all climate policy, and rural areas really need that reassurance. Without proper support and assistance in moving to more sustainable practices, climate action will be punitive, punishing the disadvantaged and those with no choice. While the government's climate action bill is welcome, it is already clear that it has serious issues with shortcomings on climate governance, accountability, target ambition, and a glaring insufficiency in reference to a just transition, which is so important for rural areas. Experts speaking before the Oireachtas Climate Action Committee, such as UCC's Dr. Anya Ryall and Maynooth University Professor John Sweeney, have highlighted issues with vague language and the absence of accountability in the bill. These criticisms are especially relevant given the Supreme Court's unanimous climate case ruling that the government's unlawful national mitigation plan was deficient in detail on reaching targets. So I can only hope that the current government has learned from this and will introduce the necessary detail and precise legislation which has accountability and a just transition at its centre. Communities are going to experience flooding. Homes, shops and businesses will be damaged, and this motion rightly demands action to mitigate these occurrences and in the meantime to provide the necessary support for communities. We need small-scale interventions now, not next year. We need guaranteed schemes and supports while we wait for large projects. Like I said, this motion has the right intention, but I have to say I certainly don't agree with all aspects of it. I think it's worth highlighting that, for example, in it says to immediately introduce a ring-fenced budget to each local authority to allow for cutting back of roadside verges, hedges and fences in rural communities in the interest of flood risk prevention and road user public safety. The bill is literally contradicting itself. Damaging hedgerows is not in the interest of flood risk prevention. If anything, we need to look at planting more. The less roots there is in the ground, the less the soil can hold the water. That's the basic science of it. I am, however, in favour of its intent to address flooding and support rural communities. People simply can't continue to go through the trauma of flooding without more support. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy.